Most people believe pressure comes from difficult situations. A deadline that arrives too soon, a conversation that turns tense without warning, a decision that needs to be made before the mind feels ready. And in those moments, the assumption is that the situation itself is the source of discomfort, that the external event is what creates the internal chaos. But pressure rarely begins with the situation itself. It begins inside the mind. A sudden challenge appears. A difficult conversation starts. A decision must be made quickly. And within seconds, thoughts begin to accelerate. The mind starts racing through possibilities, through outcomes, through worst-case scenarios that have not yet happened and may never happen. Emotion begins influencing judgment. The body tightens, breathing shortens, thinking narrows, and the situation, which was simply a situation, becomes something that feels unmanageable. Have you ever noticed how quickly the mind loses clarity when pressure appears? How a problem that seems solvable in a calm moment suddenly feels overwhelming the instant urgency enters the picture? How words that would normally come easily suddenly feel difficult to organize? How decisions that should take seconds somehow feel paralyzing? That is not the situation controlling you. That is the mind reacting to the situation in a way that has never been examined or trained. Pressure does not control the mind. Untrained reactions do. This distinction matters more than most people realize, because when the assumption is that the situation is the problem, the only solution seems to be avoiding difficult situations, avoiding pressure, avoiding challenge. And since pressure is unavoidable in any meaningful life, that approach fails consistently. But when the understanding shifts, when it becomes clear that the reaction is what creates the loss of control and not the pressure itself, then something becomes possible that was not possible before. The ability to train the reaction. Some individuals experience the same pressure that causes others to become reactive, scattered, and emotionally driven. They face the same deadlines, the same conflicts, the same uncertainty, the same high-stakes moments, and yet they remain calm, not in a performed, forced way, not by suppressing what they feel, but in a way that is precise, deliberate, and stable. Their thinking stays organized. Their words stay measured. Their decisions stay clear. The difference is rarely intelligence. It is rarely natural talent. It is not that they feel nothing. They feel the same pull of urgency, the same instinct toward reaction, the same emotional current running through a high-pressure moment. The difference is the ability to control mental reactions when pressure appears. And that ability is not something a person either has or does not have. It is something that develops through trained awareness, emotional discipline, and structured thinking built carefully over time. It is not a personality trait. It is not a gift. It is a skill. And like any skill, understanding how it works is the first step toward developing it. When pressure appears, the mind does not process it neutrally. The moment a situation is perceived as threatening, urgent, or uncertain, the brain begins doing something automatic and immediate. It shifts into a mode designed for fast response. Thinking accelerates. Attention narrows. The body prepares for action before the conscious mind has even fully assessed what is happening. This is not a flaw. It is a function. It exists because fast responses to perceived threats have always been necessary for survival. But the problem is that this same rapid response system activates in situations where speed is not the priority. In a difficult conversation, speed is not usually helpful. In a complex decision, speed often produces poor outcomes. In a negotiation, a conflict, a moment of uncertainty, the fast reaction system pushes toward urgency when what the situation actually requires is clarity. And so the mind, doing exactly what it was designed to do, begins working against the person who needs to think clearly. The speed of stress-based thinking is something most people have experienced but rarely examined. When pressure appears, thoughts do not arrive one at a time in an organized sequence. They arrive in clusters, fragments, overlapping and competing. A worry about the outcome arrives at the same moment as a memory of a similar situation. A fear about what others will think appears alongside an instinct about what to say. A question about what to do collides with a feeling of doubt about whether any answer is right. The mind under pressure is not thinking, it is reacting, and reaction, by its nature, is not organized. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They believe that the solution to mental chaos under pressure is to think more, to work through the problem faster, to push through the mental noise and arrive at clarity by force. But thinking more in a reactive state does not produce clarity. It produces more reaction, more speed, more noise. The attempt to solve the problem from inside the accelerated, emotionally driven mental state only deepens the problem. Clarity under pressure does not come from more thinking. It comes from a different quality of thinking, and that quality requires slowing down when every instinct is pushing towards speed. Fear is one of the most powerful distortions of judgment that appears under pressure. And it rarely arrives labeled as fear. It arrives as certainty, as the absolute conviction that something will go wrong, that the worst outcome is the most likely outcome, that failure is more probable than success. The mind under pressure generates these convictions with remarkable speed and remarkable confidence, and they feel like accurate assessments rather than emotional reactions. But they are not accurate assessments. They are fear dressed as analysis. The mind in a fearful state does not weigh possibilities evenly. It weights them toward the negative. It generates scenarios where things go wrong more easily and more vividly than scenarios where things go right. It finds evidence for the worst interpretation faster than evidence for a neutral or positive one. And because this process happens quickly and automatically, it feels like thinking rather than distortion. Urgency creates a similar problem, though it operates differently. Where fear distorts the content of thinking, urgency distorts the timing of thinking. The feeling that something must be decided immediately, that there is no time to slow down, that action must happen now, pushes the mind away from the careful assessment it actually needs. And very often, the urgency itself is not real. The deadline is not as immediate as it feels. The decision does not need to be made in the next 30 seconds. The conversation does not require an immediate response. The feeling of urgency is often a creation of the reactive mind, not an accurate reading of the situation. Uncertainty adds another layer. The mind has a strong preference for resolution, for knowing, for having a clear picture of what is happening and what will happen. When uncertainty is present, the mind tries to resolve it immediately. It fills in the missing information with assumptions. It makes predictions and treats them as facts. It constructs a narrative that removes the uncertainty, even when no such narrative is warranted by the available information. And so under pressure, the mind is often not working with reality. It is working with a version of reality that has been shaped by fear, distorted by urgency, and filled in with assumptions to cover uncertainty. The decisions made from that state are not based on what is actually happening. They are based on a mental construction that feels real but is not. Most people react impulsively under pressure, not because they are careless or unintelligent, but because the reactive state feels like clarity. The convictions that fear produces feel like accurate judgment. The urgency that the mind generates feels like an accurate reading of time constraints. The narrative that fills in the gaps of uncertainty feels like genuine understanding. From inside the reactive state, reaction does not feel like reaction, it feels like response. This is one of the reasons pressure is so difficult to manage without trained awareness. The untrained mind does not recognize when it has entered a reactive state. It does not register the shift from clear thinking to distorted thinking. It simply continues operating, confident that its output is reliable, while the quality of that output deteriorates. The difference between reacting to pressure and observing it is not a dramatic transformation. It is a subtle shift in orientation. The reactive mind is inside the experience, being carried by it, producing thoughts and responses that are driven by the emotional current of the moment. The observing mind is slightly separate from the experience, watching it, noticing what is happening without being entirely consumed by it. And that small separation makes an enormous difference. When the mind is inside the reaction, every thought feels like a conclusion. Every fear feels like a fact. Every impulse feels like a reasonable response. But when even a small degree of observation becomes possible, something changes. The fear can be noticed as fear rather than accepted as truth. The urgency can be recognized as a feeling rather than an accurate assessment of time. The impulsive response can be seen as a response that is about to happen, rather than a response that has already been determined. Observation creates a gap, and in that gap, choice becomes possible. Most people do not notice when the reactive state begins. They are already inside it before they have registered the shift. The mind accelerates, emotion intensifies, and the quality of thinking degrades without any conscious recognition that this is happening. The transition from clear thinking to reactive thinking is not announced. It does not come with a warning. It happens in the background, subtly, and by the time the person becomes aware that something has changed, the reactive state is already well established. This is why recognizing the moment when emotional reactions begin is one of the most valuable skills in managing pressure. Not controlling the reactions once they are fully developed. Recognizing the early signs that the reactive state is beginning to form. There are signals. The breathing changes. It becomes shorter, faster, or held unconsciously. The body tightens in specific places, often the chest, the shoulders, the jaw. Thoughts begin arriving faster than usual. The sense that something must happen immediately starts to intensify. There may be an urge to speak before thinking, to decide before considering, to act before assessing. These are not signs of pressure from outside. They are signs of the reactive state forming inside. And because they are physical and mental signals that can be observed, they can be recognized. And because they can be recognized, they create the possibility of interrupting the reactive process before it becomes fully established. This is where awareness functions as a genuine tool rather than simply a concept. The person who has learned to notice these early signals is not a different kind of person than someone who has not. They have simply developed a specific kind of attention. An attention that is partly directed inward, monitoring the internal state, noticing shifts in the quality of thinking and the presence of emotional current rather than directing all attention outward toward the situation. The inward attention does not require removing attention from the situation. It runs alongside. A part of the mind that is watching the situation, and another part that is watching how the watching mind is responding to the situation. This is not complicated in practice. It is simply a habit of self-observation that develops over time. When awareness interrupts impulsive thinking, it does not do so dramatically. It does not produce a sudden, complete transformation from reactive to calm. What it produces is a pause, a brief moment of recognition, the awareness that a reaction is forming, that the mind is accelerating, that an impulse is building. And in that recognition, the impulse loses some of its automatic force. The mental pause that restores clarity is not a long process. It does not require extended reflection or complex analysis. It is often a matter of seconds. A recognition that something is happening internally, a decision not to act on the impulse immediately, a brief space created between the stimulus and the response. But the effect of that pause is disproportionate to its brevity. Because the reactive state depends on speed, it gains power from momentum. The faster the thoughts accelerate, the stronger the emotional current becomes, the more automatic the response feels. Interrupting that momentum, even for a few seconds, disrupts the entire chain. The thoughts slow slightly. The emotion settles marginally. The automatic response becomes slightly less automatic, and in that slight change, the person regains a small degree of agency over what happens next. That small degree of agency, practiced consistently, becomes something significant. Slowing the pace of thoughts during stressful situations is not achieved by force. The attempt to simply stop thinking fast, to command the mind to slow down through willpower alone, rarely works. The reactive state does not respond to commands. It responds to changes in the body and in the quality of attention. Breathing is one of the most direct ways to influence the mental state. This is not complicated, and it does not require extensive knowledge of the mechanics involved. It simply requires the recognition that the breathing and the mental state are connected, that one influences the other, and that the breathing is something that can be voluntarily changed, even when the mental state feels automatic. When the reactive state begins, the breathing tends to become fast and shallow. The breath moves mostly in the upper chest. The rhythm quickens, and the exhale shortens. This pattern maintains and intensifies the reactive state. It keeps the body in a mode associated with urgency and threat. Deliberately slowing the breath, making the exhale longer than the inhale, and breathing from lower in the body, rather than the upper chest, begins to shift the physical state, and as the physical state shifts, the mental state shifts with it. Not completely, not instantly, but the quality of the reactive state begins to change. The thoughts slow slightly. The emotional intensity reduces marginally. The conviction that everything is urgent and threatening becomes slightly less absolute. This is not a cure for pressure. It is a tool for maintaining access to clearer thinking while pressure is present. And the value of that access cannot be overstated. Controlling breathing and internal tempo is a skill that develops with practice. In low-pressure situations, deliberately practicing slow, controlled breathing builds a connection between the breath and a calmer mental state. Over time, that connection strengthens. The body begins to associate that breathing pattern with a particular quality of calm. And when pressure appears, engaging that breathing pattern can access that calm more quickly and reliably. But beyond breathing, Internal tempo refers to the overall pace at which the mind operates, how quickly thoughts arise and are acted upon, how rapidly responses are formulated and delivered, how fast the movement is between receiving information and deciding how to respond. The reactive state accelerates all of these, and the deliberate slowing of any one of them tends to slow the others. A person who speaks more slowly than their natural reactive pace under pressure is doing something important. They are not simply slowing speech. They are creating time between thought and expression, and in that time, the thought can be examined before it becomes a spoken word. The impulse can be observed before it becomes an action. The reaction can be noticed before it becomes a decision. The strategic pause between receiving and responding is one of the most consistently useful tools in managing high-pressure situations. And yet it requires going against the instinct that pressure generates, which is the instinct to respond immediately, to demonstrate readiness, to show that the situation is being handled. Separating emotion from decision making is one of the more nuanced aspects of maintaining clarity under pressure, because the goal is not the elimination of emotion. Emotion provides information. The discomfort of a high-pressure situation is communicating something real about stakes, about what matters, about the importance of what is happening. Attempting to remove emotion entirely from decision-making removes useful information from the process. The goal is separation in a specific sense. Not removing emotion, but not allowing emotion to drive the decision. Allowing the emotional signal to be received and noted, while ensuring that the decision itself is made from a more analytical place. This requires a kind of internal sequencing. First, notice what the emotional state is communicating. There is something at stake here. There is risk. This matters. That is real information. Second, allow that information to inform the framing of the decision, without allowing it to determine the decision itself. Third, assess the situation with as much neutrality as possible, given that context. This sequence does not eliminate the influence of emotion, but it changes the relationship between emotion and decision. The emotion becomes an input rather than the driver, and the difference between those two positions, emotion as input versus emotion as driver, is the difference between decisions made with awareness and decisions made reactively. There is something that happens when the people around you are panicking. When urgency and fear become the dominant tone in the environment, when others are visibly losing their composure, when the group energy is moving toward chaos, the natural human response is to synchronize with that energy. The nervous system picks up the signals of threat and urgency from others. The emotional state of the group becomes contagious. Maintaining clarity when others around you panic requires a specific kind of internal stability, not the stability of not being affected by the environment. The calm person in a chaotic environment is affected. They register the urgency, the fear, the emotional intensity of those around them, but they do not merge with it. There is a distinction between receiving the signal and being carried by it. The person who has developed internal stability can receive the signal of panic from their environment, process it, assess the actual level of threat it represents, and respond based on that assessment rather than on the emotional energy itself. This is not indifference. It is not a failure to recognize the seriousness of a situation. It is the ability to evaluate the situation on its own terms, rather than through the amplified lens of collective panic. And there is something else that happens when one person in a group maintains clarity. while others lose it. The calm person's presence begins to influence the group. Not through instruction, not through telling people to calm down, which almost never works and often increases tension, but simply through the quality of their presence, the steadiness of their voice, the deliberateness of their actions, the fact that they are responding to the situation rather than reacting to the emotional atmosphere. Calm is contagious in the same way panic is contagious, but it operates more slowly and requires more stability in the individual carrying it. A single person in a state of panic can rapidly pull an entire group toward disorder. A single person in a state of genuine calm can gradually pull a group toward stability. This is why calm thinkers often end up influencing group decisions in high-pressure situations, not necessarily because they are the most experienced or the most knowledgeable, but because the quality of their presence creates a space in which clearer thinking becomes possible for those around them. Reducing mental noise during high-stakes moments is partly about what to attend to and partly about what to deliberately not attend to. The reactive mind generates enormous amounts of material, most of which is not useful. The worst-case scenarios that it constructs, the fears about what others will think, the rehearsal of past failures that feel similar to the current situation, the self-critical commentary running in the background, the questions about whether the right decision has been made or will be made or can possibly be made. None of this is inherently useful. It is noise generated by a reactive system trying to manage a perceived threat through mental activity. And the problem with this noise is not simply that it is unpleasant. It is that it consumes cognitive resources that are needed for actual assessment and decision-making. The mind has limits. When significant cognitive and emotional resources are being consumed by the generation of worst-case scenarios and self-critical commentary, fewer resources are available for clear thinking. The mental noise of the reactive state is not a background experience that can be ignored while full capacity is maintained elsewhere. It is a drain on capacity, deliberately reducing that noise, not by suppressing it, but by redirecting attention toward what is actually relevant to the situation at hand, recovers some of that cognitive resource. The question that matters in a high-pressure situation is not what could go wrong in the worst possible scenario. It is what is actually happening right now and what response is appropriate to what is actually happening. Focusing attention on what is real, present, and relevant rather than on what is feared, imagined, or uncertain is a discipline. It requires consistent redirection. The reactive mind will continue generating noise. The task is not to silence it permanently, but to notice when it is generating noise rather than useful information, and to redirect attention back to what is actually relevant. Detaching ego from stressful outcomes is another dimension of maintaining clarity under pressure, and it is one that is often underestimated. Many high-pressure situations carry an ego dimension. They are not simply problems to be solved. They are situations where how the person performs is being evaluated by others or by themselves. The stakes are not only about the outcome, but about what the outcome means for how the person is perceived and how they perceive themselves. This ego dimension significantly amplifies the emotional intensity of high-pressure situations. A difficult conversation is not just a conversation. It is a situation where the person must appear capable, must not show weakness, must not say the wrong thing, must demonstrate that they can handle this. A complex decision is not just a decision. It is a test of judgment of intelligence, of leadership ability. When the ego is fully engaged in the outcome, the pressure multiplies. The fear of being seen to fail is layered on top of the actual challenge. The fear of looking foolish or weak or incompetent runs alongside the genuine difficulty of the situation. And that additional fear adds to the emotional load, consumes additional cognitive resources, and further distorts thinking. Detaching ego from the outcome does not mean not caring about the outcome. It means reducing the layer of self-referential concern that transforms a difficult situation into a personal threat. The question is no longer, what does this say about me? But what does this situation actually require? That shift is subtle but significant. The person who is primarily concerned with demonstrating their capability is directing some attention toward themselves. The person who is primarily concerned with what the situation actually requires can direct all attention outward toward the situation. And that outward focus produces clearer assessment and better decisions. Remaining composed during conflict or disagreement presents a particular challenge because conflict and disagreement are inherently interpersonal, and interpersonal pressure activates dimensions of the reactive state that purely internal pressure does not. When someone challenges a position, expresses hostility, creates a confrontational dynamic, the emotional current that arises is not simply about the content of the disagreement. It is about the relationship, about status, about being heard and respected, about not being dominated. These dimensions of interpersonal conflict are deeply embedded. The reaction to being challenged, contradicted, or treated dismissively is immediate and powerful. And in that reactivity, the content of the disagreement often becomes secondary. What matters in the reactive state is winning, defending, not being diminished, and from that state, the conflict tends to escalate. Each reactive response triggers a reactive response in return. The emotional temperature rises. The original disagreement, which may have been relatively simple, becomes entangled in layers of ego, defensiveness, and emotional charge. The composed mind in a conflict or disagreement maintains a different orientation. It stays with the content of the disagreement rather than moving toward the interpersonal dynamics of winning and defending. It can hear a challenge to its position without experiencing the challenge as a personal attack. It can acknowledge a valid point made by the other person without experiencing that acknowledgement as a defeat. This requires not only emotional regulation, but a certain clarity about what the conversation is actually for. If the purpose of the conversation is to resolve a genuine disagreement and reach a better outcome, then acknowledging valid points made by the other person serves that purpose. From the composed mind, acknowledging a valid point is not losing, it is thinking clearly. The strategic advantage of delayed responses is something that composed thinkers understand intuitively, but that the reactive mind finds almost impossible to accept. The reactive mind experiences a delay as a weakness, as an inability to respond, as an exposure of the person's inadequacy. But a delayed response is almost always a better response when pressure is present. The impulse that forms in the first few seconds of a high-pressure situation is shaped by the reactive state. It reflects the emotional charge of the moment, rather than a clear assessment of the situation. It is fast, but it is not accurate, and a fast, inaccurate response in a high-stakes situation has costs that a slower, more accurate response does not. The person who takes a breath before responding to a hostile comment in a difficult conversation is not showing weakness. They are creating the space in which a response worth giving can form. The person who does not immediately fill every silence in a tense negotiation is not demonstrating inadequacy. They are exercising a patience that serves the outcome. Silence and delay are uncomfortable to the reactive mind because they feel like vulnerability. But they are tools, and the composed thinker who has learned to use them has a significant advantage over someone who must respond immediately to everything because the discomfort of silence is unbearable. Developing mental endurance during prolonged stress is a different challenge than managing a single high-pressure moment. A single high-pressure moment is intense but finite. The peak of intensity is experienced, the reactive state is managed as best it can be, and the moment passes. Mental endurance is required when the pressure is not a moment, but a sustained condition. When the stress is ongoing, when the difficult situation does not resolve quickly, but extends over days, weeks, or longer. Prolonged stress creates a different kind of degradation than acute pressure. With acute pressure, the reactive state spikes and then subsides. With prolonged stress, the reactive state becomes a baseline condition. The body and mind adapt to the sustained pressure by remaining in a lower level but persistent state of heightened reactivity, and from that baseline, thinking quality suffers in quieter, less obvious ways. Decision-making becomes more conservative. Risk tolerance decreases not from careful assessment, but from a generalized fear response that has become chronic. Creativity and flexible thinking reduce because the mind is operating in a defensive mode. Emotional regulation becomes more effortful because the resources that support it are being continuously taxed. Building mental endurance under prolonged stress requires specific practices rather than simply enduring. The mind and body need genuine recovery, not distraction, but recovery. Time when the reactive state is genuinely reduced. When attention is not focused on the stressor, when the physiological signals of the stress response can settle. This recovery is not a luxury. It is what maintains the capacity for clear thinking when the pressure returns. And alongside recovery, the person under prolonged stress benefits from practices that maintain perspective. The tendency of the stressed mind is toward tunnel vision, toward seeing the stressor as all-encompassing, as defining the entirety of the situation. Deliberately maintaining a broader view, a view that includes what is working, what is stable, what has been successfully navigated, is not denial of the difficulty. It is accurate perception that the stressed mind tends to lose. Why controlled thinking leads to better decisions is something that becomes obvious in retrospect, but is easy to forget in the moment. The decisions made from a reactive state, however fast and confident they feel in the moment, tend to reflect the distortions of that state. They overweight negative outcomes. They underestimate the time available for consideration. They are influenced by the desire to relieve the discomfort of the moment rather than by a careful assessment of what serves the long-term outcome. And because the reactive state generates its outputs with great confidence, the poor quality of those decisions is often not recognized until after the consequences become clear. Controlled thinking does not guarantee perfect decisions. It guarantees decisions made from a clearer assessment of the actual situation. Decisions that reflect what is known rather than what is feared. Decisions that consider the available time accurately rather than responding to artificial urgency. Decisions that account for long-term consequences rather than being driven purely by the desire for immediate relief. Over time, The difference between decisions made from reactive states and decisions made from composed states accumulates significantly. The person who consistently manages to think clearly under pressure makes consistently better decisions. And consistently better decisions produce consistently better outcomes. The compounding effect of this difference, over months and years, is substantial. The training of mental stability under pressure is not a dramatic process. It does not involve intense experiences or extreme challenges. It develops through small, consistent practices applied in ordinary situations. The person who practices noticing their reactive state during minor stresses, during small frustrations and mild uncertainties, builds the same awareness that will be available during major pressures. The awareness does not scale up automatically. It develops through repetition. Each time a mild reactive state is recognized and a small pause is created, the neural pathway associated with that recognition is strengthened slightly. Each time breathing is deliberately slowed in a low-stakes situation, the connection between controlled breathing and a calmer mental state is reinforced. Each time a minor impulse is observed rather than immediately acted upon, the habit of observation becomes slightly more established. These small practices accumulate into something significant because they are fundamentally about changing the default response. The default response to pressure, without training, is reaction. With consistent practice, the default response begins to shift toward observation, not because the reactive instinct disappears, but because the habit of pausing and observing becomes strong enough to interrupt the reactive instinct before it has fully determined the response. The long-term benefits of pressure control in leadership, in negotiations, and in complex decision-making are not simply about performing better in individual high-pressure moments. They are about the quality of relationships and outcomes that develop over time when a person consistently demonstrates this kind of stability. In leadership, the person who remains composed under pressure creates a specific kind of trust. Not trust based on always having the right answer, but trust based on reliability of judgment. The people around that leader know that when things get difficult, the thinking will not deteriorate. The decisions will not become erratic. The emotional atmosphere will not shift into panic, and that reliability is deeply stabilizing for everyone operating within that person's sphere of influence. In negotiations, the person who can manage the emotional pressure of a difficult exchange without losing access to clear thinking has a consistent advantage. They can hear what is being said accurately, rather than through the filter of defensiveness or anxiety. They can identify the actual interests at stake rather than reacting only to the positions being expressed. They can tolerate silence and uncertainty in ways that their counterpart may not be able to, and that tolerance creates space for better outcomes. In complex decisions, the person who can maintain clarity under the pressure of uncertainty, of time constraints, of the knowledge that the decision matters, brings a quality of thinking to the process that the reactive mind cannot produce. The assessment is clearer. The range of options considered is broader. The evaluation of consequences is more accurate. And the confidence in the decision, once made, rests on a more solid foundation. There is another dimension of pressure that is rarely discussed, but that affects the quality of thinking in significant ways. It is the pressure that comes not from external situations but from internal standards. The pressure a person places on themselves, the standard of performance they hold themselves to, the self-critical voice that evaluates every decision, every response, every outcome against a benchmark that is sometimes impossible to meet. This internal pressure operates constantly, even in the absence of external stressors. And when external pressure is added to internal pressure, the combined load can be substantial. The reactive state that forms under this combined pressure is not simply about the external situation. It is about the fear of falling short of the internal standard, the fear of confirming the self-critical narrative, the fear that the way the pressure is handled will serve as evidence that the person is not capable, not ready, not good enough. Managing internal pressure requires a particular kind of honesty. The internal standard needs to be examined. Is it accurate? Is it useful? Does the standard produce better performance, or does it primarily produce anxiety that reduces performance? A high standard that is set with clarity and realism is a useful tool. A standard that is set as an expression of self-doubt, as a demand that perfection be achieved in order to prove that the person is not the failure they fear they are, is not a useful tool. It is a source of pressure that does not serve the person. The composed mind is not one that has eliminated standards or that does not care about quality. It is one that holds standards in a way that motivates rather than destabilizes, that evaluates outcomes with honesty rather than through the lens of self-condemnation, that can acknowledge what did not work and adjust without spiraling into self-criticism that consumes the resources needed to do better. This is a nuanced balance. It requires both high standards and a certain freedom from attachment to those standards, not the freedom of not caring, but the freedom of knowing that the self is not defined by any individual performance. That a poor decision in a high-pressure moment is information to be learned from, not evidence of fundamental inadequacy. As internal pressure becomes more manageable, external pressure becomes easier to handle as well, because a significant portion of what makes external pressure overwhelming is not the external situation itself, but the internal pressure it activates. The fear of failure, the fear of judgment, the fear of not being able to handle what is happening. When those internal fears are reduced through a more grounded and accurate relationship with the self, external pressure retains its objective reality but loses the amplification that internal fear provides. The person who has genuinely reduced their internal self-pressure does not experience external pressure as less real. They experience it as more manageable, because they are dealing with the actual situation rather than the actual situation plus all the fears the situation activates. There is a quality that develops in the person who has worked on managing pressure over a sustained period. It is not the absence of emotional experience. It is not a flattened or reduced capacity to feel. It is something more like groundedness, a stability that exists alongside the full range of emotional experience. That allows fear to be felt without being believed as absolute truth. That allows urgency to be registered without being acted upon automatically. That allows the intensity of a high-pressure moment to be fully present, without overwhelming the thinking process. This groundedness is not developed through a single insight or a single experience. It is built through the accumulation of practices and small choices over time, through each instance of noticing the reactive state and creating a pause, through each breath deliberately slowed in a moment of stress, through each impulse observed rather than blindly acted upon, through each decision to address the actual situation rather than the worst-case version of it. The accumulation is quiet. It does not announce itself. There is no dramatic moment where it becomes clear that the capacity for clarity under pressure has been fully developed. It simply becomes gradually evident that high-pressure situations are being navigated more effectively than they used to be, that the reactive state is being recognized more quickly, that the pause between stimulus and response is more consistently available, that the quality of thinking in difficult moments is more reliably clear. And alongside this development, something else changes. The relationship to pressure itself changes. The person who was once avoidant of high-pressure situations, who arranged their life to minimize challenge and risk in order to minimize the discomfort of pressure, begins to relate to those situations differently. Not with eagerness for difficulty, not with a manufactured desire for challenge, but with a quiet confidence that the pressure can be handled, that clarity can be maintained, that the quality of thinking will not collapse when the stakes are high. This confidence is not arrogance. It is not the belief that nothing will go wrong or that every high-pressure situation will be navigated perfectly. It is simply the recognition that the capacity to think clearly under pressure is available, that the reactive state will arise, as it always does, and that it can be managed, that the pause can be found, that the breath can be slowed, that the emotion can be observed rather than merged with. That quiet confidence changes what becomes possible. The person with it can engage with challenges that the person without it would avoid, can have difficult conversations that need to be had, can make decisions that need to be made under uncertainty and time pressure, can stay present in situations that others would escape, not because the pressure is not felt, but because the pressure does not produce the loss of control it once did. The breadth of situations where mental clarity under pressure matters is wider than it might initially appear. The obvious examples, the high-stakes negotiations, the leadership moments, the critical decisions, are only part of the picture. Mental clarity under pressure is relevant in the daily, unremarkable situations where small pressures arise and are either managed or reacted to. The conversation that turns unexpectedly tense, the plan that falls apart without warning, the unexpected criticism, the misunderstanding that escalates, the moment of uncertainty about the right course of action. These ordinary pressures are the training ground for the capacity to manage extraordinary ones. Every small reactive state recognized and paused is practice. Every minor impulse observed before being acted upon is practice. Every breath deliberately slowed in a moment of low-stakes frustration is practice. The person who waits for major high-pressure situations to develop their pressure management capacity is not building the skill when it is most needed. They are hoping the skill will appear without having been developed. The development happens in the small moments, and when the large moments arrive, the capacity that was built in small moments is what is available. There is one more element worth addressing, which is the relationship between composure and honest expression. Managing pressure well does not mean presenting a surface of perfect calm while the reactive state rages underneath. That approach produces its own problems. It is exhausting to maintain. It suppresses the internal signals that provide useful information, and the suppressed state tends to emerge eventually in less controlled ways. The goal is not the performance of composure. It is the development of genuine internal stability. The difference matters because genuine stability allows for honest expression alongside the stability. The person who is genuinely composed can acknowledge that a situation is difficult without losing their composure. They can express concern, disagreement, or uncertainty without those expressions being driven by reactive emotion. They can communicate the reality of what they are experiencing in a way that is honest and clear, without being destabilizing. This combination of internal stability and honest expression is more sustainable and more effective than either extreme. The person who suppresses all emotional expression in the name of composure is not more composed than the person who expresses themselves honestly from a stable internal state. They are simply less honest, and the suppression carries its own costs. The person who has developed genuine stability can be both composed and real, both clear and human, both deliberate and honest about the fact that the situation is genuinely challenging. Now there is something that deserves attention as all of these ideas are absorbed and considered. The mind that is reading or listening to this has been doing exactly what the untrained mind does when it encounters ideas it finds valuable. It has been engaging with them intellectually, recognizing their merit, perhaps even feeling a sense of understanding that suggests the understanding is complete. But intellectual understanding of how to manage pressure is not the same as having developed the capacity to manage it. The gap between knowing and doing, between understanding and having built the habit, is significant. And the only way to close that gap is through practice. Through the deliberate application of these understandings in real situations, starting with small ones, through the repetition that builds habits, through the consistency that transforms insight into capability. The ideas themselves are not the training, they are the map. The territory is the actual experience of being in a reactive state and choosing, in that moment, to pause, to breathe, to observe, to delay the response. The territory is the actual application of this understanding in situations where the reactive instinct is pushing toward speed and the developed habit is pushing toward pause. That gap can only be closed through living it, not through understanding it. And so the value of everything described here is entirely dependent on what happens after the listening ends, on the quality of attention brought to ordinary moments of low-level pressure, on the consistency with which the tools are applied, on the patience with the process of developing a capacity that grows slowly rather than appearing all at once. The mind is trainable. The reactive patterns that feel fixed are not fixed. The default response to pressure that has been established over years of untrained reaction can change. It changes slowly. It changes through small, consistent efforts. It changes in ways that are often not immediately obvious. But it changes. And the person who understands this, who does not expect transformation to happen quickly or completely, who commits to the small practices and applies them with patience, who measures progress not by the absence of the reactive state, but by how consistently and how quickly it is recognized and managed, that person will find that their relationship to pressure genuinely shifts over time. Not to a place where pressure does not exist, not to a place where the reactive instinct never arises, but to a place where the reactive instinct is met by a trained awareness, where the impulse is observed before it becomes an action, where the breath can be slowed, where the pause can be found, and from that place, thinking under pressure becomes possible in a way that it simply was not before. Pressure is unavoidable. It will continue to appear in the form of difficult situations, challenging conversations, complex decisions, and moments of uncertainty where clarity seems most needed and hardest to maintain. This is the nature of a life engaged with anything that matters. The presence of pressure is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something is at stake. But losing control under pressure is not unavoidable. That part is not determined by the pressure itself. It is determined by the degree to which the internal response to pressure has been understood and trained. The individuals who maintain clarity during difficult moments share certain quiet patterns. They are not dramatic patterns. They are not visible to others in the way that a composed exterior might suggest. They are internal habits, repeated consistently, that have gradually changed the relationship between the person and the reactive state that pressure produces. They slow their reactions, not by suppressing the reactive instinct, but by creating the small pause that interrupts its automatic force. They observe their thoughts during high-pressure moments rather than simply thinking them. They notice the fear dressed as certainty, the urgency that may not reflect actual time constraints, the worst-case narratives that the stressed mind generates with such confidence. And in noticing, they create the distance needed to assess whether what the reactive mind is producing is accurate. They allow emotion to settle before making decisions, not by waiting for emotion to disappear entirely, because it does not disappear entirely, and the information it carries is sometimes relevant, but by allowing the initial intensity to reduce, by not acting on the peak of the emotional wave, but waiting for the wave to pass its peak and settle into something that can be examined more clearly. They maintain their breathing deliberately in situations where the natural tendency is for breath to shorten and quicken. They speak more slowly than the reactive state would prefer. They tolerate silence and delay when the reactive instinct demands immediate response. They focus attention on what is actually present and actually relevant rather than on what is feared and imagined. And over time, this discipline strengthens mental stability. Each application reinforces the capacity. Each small moment of choosing observation over reaction builds the habit of observation. Each breath deliberately slowed in a moment of stress makes the next deliberate breath slightly more accessible. The accumulation is gradual, quiet, and real. There is something worth noting about how this development feels from the inside. It does not feel like a growing power over pressure. It does not feel like a fortification against difficulty. It feels more like a growing familiarity with the reactive state, a recognition of it when it appears, a kind of ease with the fact of its presence without being entirely captured by it. The person who has developed this capacity does not look at a high-pressure situation with confidence that they will feel nothing. They look at it with a kind of quiet readiness, knowing the reactive state will arise, knowing the thoughts will accelerate, knowing the emotion will generate pressure to act before the mind is ready, and knowing, from practice, that none of these things need to determine the response. That knowing is not certainty. No one is certain in a high-pressure situation, but it is enough. It is enough to find the pause, to slow the breath, to observe what is happening internally, to assess the situation accurately enough to make a response that is worth giving. The next time pressure appears, there will be a brief moment before the mind begins reacting. It will be a small moment, easy to miss. The situation will appear, the reactive instinct will begin to stir, and in the space between those two events, there will be a gap, a brief window, a small silence before the storm of accelerated thought begins. Most people miss that moment. They are already inside the reactive state, before the gap registers as something that could have been used. The thoughts have already begun accelerating, the emotion has already begun intensifying, and the automatic response is already forming before they are aware that a choice was available. But once that moment is learned to be recognized, something changes. That small gap, which used to pass unnoticed, becomes visible, and in becoming visible, it becomes available. Not to make a perfect decision, not to eliminate the reactive state entirely, but to pause, to breathe once, to observe what is beginning to happen, to create, even briefly, a separation between the stimulus and the response. That separation, which is measured in seconds, is where control lives. Because control does not come from removing pressure. Pressure cannot be removed. It is a permanent feature of any life where things matter and outcomes are uncertain. Control does not come from eliminating the reactive instinct. The reactive instinct is built into the system and will always arise when pressure appears. Control comes from learning how to think clearly while pressure is present, from building the capacity to observe the reactive state rather than simply being inside it, from developing the habit of the pause, the slow breath, the deliberate response, through consistent practice in ordinary situations until those habits become the default rather than the exception. That is the discipline. Quiet, unglamorous, and enormously powerful. The capacity to think clearly, act deliberately, and remain stable in the moments when everything is pushing toward speed, reaction, and the loss of clarity. It is available to anyone willing to build it, one small moment at a time.